Good evening. On behalf of the Indiana University College of Arts and Sciences, thank you for joining us tonight. I'm Vanessa Clow, and I serve as the college's Director of Alumni Relations. Our Food for Thought live streaming series serves as an opportunity for alumni and friends to hear from faculty experts, explore topics of interest, and stay connected with IU and the College of Arts and Sciences, regardless of your location. At this time, I'm delighted to introduce tonight's featured presenter, Sarah Phillips. A professor in the Department of Anthropology, Dr. Phillips' research focuses on cultural and medical anthropology, gender studies, disability studies, and Cold War literary diplomacy. She has written books about the women's movement and the disability rights movement in Ukraine and has published articles on Chernobyl, HIV/AIDS, drug use, and other issues in Ukraine. She is currently writing a book about the American author Kurt Vonnegut's popularity in the USSR in the 1970s. Following her talk, Professor Phillips will be joined by Dr. Tatiana Saburova for the audience Q&A session. Dr. Saburova is a lecturer in the IU Department of History and a former co-director of the Russian Studies Workshop here at Indiana University. She has written books about the Russian intellectuals in the 19th century and the revolutionary populism. And she has published articles on education, history, and memory in Imperial and Soviet Russia. She specializes in visual and cultural Russian history, and her current research focuses on photography, cartography, and exploration in the Russian Empire's borderlands. You can submit your questions at any point during this evening's discussion. Simply click on the Q&A tab located in your webinar toolbar. Hover your mouse over your screen and your toolbar should appear. Closed captioning is also available. Now, it is my pleasure to welcome Professor Phillips for her presentation. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Vanessa. And I'm just so grateful to the College of Arts and Sciences for this opportunity to share what I think is a really fascinating story about Kurt Vonnegut in the Soviet Union and his popularity there. So thanks so much for this. And I'm going to launch right in because I sure have a lot to share with you. And I want to make sure that I can use every minute fully. All right, so Kurt Vonnegut in and the Soviet Union. As I mentioned, this is a really exciting story, and I think it's especially exciting in this forum through Indiana University because there are so many connections between Kurt Vonnegut's popularity in the Soviet Union and not only the state of Indiana, but Indiana University in particular. So the most obvious connection with Indiana, of course, is that Kurt Vonnegut was a born and bred Hoosier from Indianapolis. But there are several really unexpected connections to Indiana University, and it was in large part thanks to some connections through Indiana that Vonnegut's books traveled to the Soviet Union and got translated there by one of the most preeminent translators in the Soviet Union at the time, Rita Wright. We're going to learn a lot about Rita Wright during this talk. And it's also in part thanks to Indiana University and those connections that Kurt Vonnegut himself traveled several times to the Soviet Union to meet with his translator. So before launching in, I want to give you a little bit of a roadmap of what we're going to focus on today, what the talk is going to be like. So I will give you a little bit of a research background, how I came to the project, what were my sources for the project, and I would love to share some really unique artifacts with you. And then I'll introduce you to some of the main characters and people that played a large part in Kurt Vonnegut's popularity in the Soviet Union. And we will follow him on his travels to Moscow and St. Petersburg. At the time it was Leningrad, of course, and along the way, and especially at the end of the presentation, I'm going to talk a lot about why is it that Soviet readers in the 1970s fell in love with Kurt Vonnegut. So let's go ahead and begin our journey. Our first stop is to talk a little bit about archival resources. Now, I am an anthropologist. I'm a cultural anthropologist and a medical anthropologist. And prior to this project, I had not spent a lot of time doing archival research. And I was really blown away by the amazing things that I was able to track down in the archives that you can see listed on this slide. A huge repository of information about Kurt Vonnegut, of course, resides in the Kurt Vonnegut papers right here in the IU Lilly Library. I also used the archives of the Ekstrom Library at the University of Louisville to access the papers of Donald Feeney. Some of his papers are also at the IU Lilly Library, and I will explain shortly why Donald Feeney is such an integral part of this story. So a few other archives that I was able to access here in the US, the Columbia University archive has some correspondence from Rita Wright, also known as Rita Wright Kovalova, who was Kurt Vonnegut's principal translator in the Soviet Union. I have an interesting document from the FBI I'm going to share with you. And I also traveled abroad for this research. I was in Moscow, I was in St. Petersburg, Russia. I was also in Bremen in Germany, and several colleagues who knew Rita Wright were including Konstantin Azadovsky, who is a preeminent literary scholar living in St. Petersburg, were kind enough to share their archives with me, their personal correspondence. I should also give a shout out to my colleague Barb, who is in Finland, who also was very, very helpful sharing her letters. I also conducted interviews. So I think this is one of the unique things that I'm able to bring to the project and to the table as an anthropologist. Not only was I able to find some really wonderful archival documents and artifacts, I was also able to travel to the former Soviet Union and do interviews with friends and acquaintances of Kurt Vonnegut and Donald Feeney, who we'll talk about in a moment, as well as the translator Rita Wright. I began a large portion of this project actually right before the COVID pandemic hit. So thankfully, I took a long research trip to Russia in the fall of 2019. And then when the pandemic came around in early 2020, I had to switch my research methods to doing virtual interviews. So that was an interesting experience, but nevertheless, I was able to really just get some invaluable insights from people who had read Kurt Vonnegut as young people in the Soviet Union in the 1970s, and friends and colleagues of Vonnegut, Feeney, and Wright. So I keep mentioning Donald Feeney, who is this wonderful person who basically introduced Kurt Vonnegut to the Soviet Union. Donald Feeney was a middle school teacher in Louisville, Kentucky, who in the I'm not great with dates. That's how I'm not a real historian. But I believe it was in the late 50s that he was actually fired from his teaching job in Louisville as a middle school teacher for having his students read Salinger's Catcher in the Rye. And when he lost his job, he made a major pivot and decided to go to earn his PhD in Slavic languages and literatures. And thankfully for us, he earned his PhD in Slavic languages and literatures right here at Indiana University. He continued to really be fascinated with J.D. Salinger. He wanted to write Salinger's biography. Unfortunately, Salinger did not cooperate with that effort, and so Donald Feeney had to jettison that project. But one of the things he was interested in was learning about Salinger's popularity in the Soviet Union. And so in 1967, we have this letter that Donald Feeney wrote to the already famous translator Rita Wright, who had translated Salinger in the late 1950s in the Soviet Union, translated Catcher in the Rye into Russian to great, great acclaim. And so actually previous to this, in 1961, we have Donald Feeney's first letter to Rita Wright asking her about her translation of Salinger and his popularity in the Soviet Union. So Donald Feeney and Rita Wright start this really active and very interesting correspondence in 1961. The first mention of Kurt Vonnegut in their correspondence shows up on September 6, 1967, in this letter that I'm sharing right here. And you'll see Rita Wright is writing to Feeney, and she says, I loved the Vonnegut books. How does he stand in USA? And this is the first clue that we have that Donald Feeney had shared Vonnegut books with Rita Wright, probably in 1966. He made his first trip to the Soviet Union to do some archival work on his dissertation at IU. In 1966, and clearly had taken some books written by Kurt Vonnegut to this famous translator, Rita Wright, who he had been in touch with by then for at least 5 years. So what were the books by Kurt Vonnegut that Feeney would have given Rita Wright during this first trip to the USSR in 1966? It could have been 5 of these 6 books. It could have been all of these books except for Slaughterhouse-Five, because Slaughterhouse-Five was not published until 1969. But he very well could have taken Rita Wright, Player Piano, The Sirens of Titan, Mother Night, Cat's Cradle, or God Bless You, Mr. Rosewater. All of these books had been published by Kurt Vonnegut by 1966. So again, because Rita Wright is such a vital part of the story of how Kurt Vonnegut really exploded onto the scene in the Soviet Union, I want to spend a little time introducing you to this wonderful woman. She was born as Raisa Chernomordik in 1898. She was born near the city of Kharkiv, which is now in Ukraine. At the time she was born, it would have been part of the Russian Empire. Rita was born into an intelligentsia family. Her father was a doctor. The family lived well. She was attended to by a Scottish governess, and she attended the Kursk Gymnasium for women, where she graduated in 1917. Her father was Jewish. Her mother was probably Jewish as well. We don't quite know. And the family, as I mentioned, was a family of the intelligentsia. At home, they spoke Russian, they spoke French and German. And of course, with her Scottish governess, Rita would have spoken English. So she was extremely fluent in all of those 4 languages. She entered medical school, intending to become a medical doctor like her father. She entered medical school in Kharkiv and eventually moved to Moscow to complete her medical studies. She moved to Moscow in the 1920s. And there she happened upon the world of literary creativity. She was part of all of the burgeoning movements to move ahead life in this new country, the Soviet Union, to experiment with literary forms and creative forms. And so she was exposed to just a wonderfully rich literary world. Before Rita Wright discovered Kurt Vonnegut's work, um, and so I should add that in this kind of milieu, she went on to become a scientist, and in fact, she worked in the Brain Institute with the famous Pavlov, who we've all heard of. Um, but she was sacked in the mid 1930s, as part of Stalin's purges. Basically, it's unclear what the reason was. Her sister had been arrested, but there were also some other colleagues at the Pavlov Institute who were blacklisted and repressed, and so it could have been through that connection. So she lost her job as a scientist and goes on to become a full-fledged translator as her career. So before Rita Wright discovered Kurt Vonnegut, she had done many impactful translations. I mentioned her translation of Salinger. She had translated William Faulkner, Mark Twain. She was known as a Robert Burns expert, and she also did many translations from the French and from the German, including the Diary of Anne Frank. And I'll just briefly show a slide that depicts the cover of Salinger's Catcher in the Rye, which Rita Wright translated in 1957. Actually, it was published, as many translations of foreign literature were as the time, in a serial form. So there were these really important literary journals that had huge subscriptions, and translations of foreign literature would be rolled out in these journals in serialized form. And that happened with Catcher in the Rye in 1957. This was a reissue of that translation that appeared in book form in 1965. So I want to give you a brief rundown of the kind of the order in which Vonnegut in translation appeared in the Soviet Union. You'll notice in 1967 that Player Piano was translated, but it wasn't translated by Rita Wright. It was translated by someone named Bruchnova, and frankly, this book went pretty much unnoticed. It did not make a huge impact. The word is that the translation was not very good. However, in 1970, that is when Kurt Vonnegut in translation in the Soviet Union really makes a huge splash. And that is when Rita Wright's translations of both Slaughterhouse-Five and Cat's Cradle appeared pretty much simultaneously. They both appeared in serialized form in these huge literary journals that I mentioned. One is called New World or Novy Mir, and the other, where Cat's Cradle appeared, is called Молодая Гвардия or Young Guard. Then going on through the 1970s, we have assorted stories that Rita Wright translated, as well as a few stories that her daughter, Margarita Kovalyova, translated. She also became a translator, and they often work together on translations, including some of Vonnegut. Then in 1975, we have Breakfast of Champions that comes out in serialized form in Foreign Literature, another one of those huge journals, Иностранная литература. And perhaps surprisingly, at the end of 1975, beginning of 1976, a play version of Slaughterhouse-Five, called The Wanderings of Billy Pilgrim, is staged in Moscow at the Soviet Army Theater. and it's based on Rita Wright's translation of Slaughterhouse-Five. A huge cultural event, so many things to say about that, and I have a few more remarks to make about that in just a bit. Moving along to the sort of translation timeline, because these serialized translations of Kurt Vonnegut's work were so popular and frankly very hard to find, because they all sold out immediately when the journals were published. We see that there were several compilations that were published in 1978. There's a collection, and then in 1981, there's another collection of Vonnegut books. So a question that arises is, why was Kurt Vonnegut a sanctioned writer in the USSR? How is it that the Soviet authorities, who at this time in the 1970s were really careful about what was being published, really careful about what Soviet citizens were exposed to, how is it that he was a sanctioned writer? There are several different reasons. One of them is the fact that Vonnegut, of course, was a World War II veteran. He had survived the Dresden firestorm, and he was liberated by the Soviet Army, liberated from Dresden by the Soviet Army when he was a POW. Vonnegut never let this fact be overlooked when he had any engagements that had anything to do with the Soviet Union. He always stated his gratitude to the Soviet Army. Vonnegut was seen as a friend of the Soviet Union, in large part because he was such a strong critic of the U.S. war in Vietnam. So he was virulently against the Vietnam War, but also had credibility as a war veteran himself. Oftentimes he was framed as a blue-collar writer who was critical of inequality and who was a friend of the working classes. And there had been a period of loosening during the thaw in the 1960s, basically after Stalin's death in 1953. For the next decade, there was a thaw and there was more room for literature and translation to come to the Soviet Union, and really literature became a staging grounds for cultural diplomacy between the USSR and Western countries. So these are some of the reasons that Vonnegut was a sanctioned writer in the USSR, why translations of his work could appear in official outlets, right, as opposed to underground samizdat or self-published publications. This is a wonderful photo that shows Rita Wright, the translator, with Kurt Vonnegut. Donald Feeney, Kurt Vonnegut, and Rita Wright kept an active correspondence beginning in the early 1970s. And it was actually Rita Wright who asked Donald Feeney to contact Vonnegut for her. You remember, she had translated Slaughterhouse-Five and Cat's Cradle in 1970 to great acclaim. She heard a rumor that Kurt Vonnegut was going to accompany Nixon to to Moscow on a visit in 1972, and she desperately wanted to meet him. Now, that rumor was false. He was not coming to Moscow with Nixon. But it set off this correspondence between Rita Wright and Kurt Vonnegut, and they did meet actually in 1972 for the first time in Paris. Rita Wright was there working on one of her translations. She had been allowed to go to Paris to do so. Kurt Vonnegut was in London, but he made a special trip to Paris to meet Rita Wright for 2 or 3 days in October of 1972. And so the caption of this photo reads, "For Donald Feeney, who created this meeting between Rita Wright, my translator in the Soviet Union, and myself in Paris on October 28th, 1972, photo by Jill Kremens." And of course, Jill Kremens was a prominent photographer, Kurt Vonnegut's partner, and they had traveled together to Paris to meet Rita Wright. So we'll talk a little bit more about Vonnegut's travels to the Soviet Union soon. But meanwhile, I want to drive home the point that Vonnegut really wanted Rita Wright to be able to come to the United States. So after he had met her in Paris, he wrote this op-ed for the New York Times book review that says, "Translators in the USSR discover what they think are good books in foreign languages, and then they have to persuade their government to publish them. And when one considers the books which Rita Wright has caused to be read by her people, one is bound to admit that she has done as much for international understanding on a deep level as anybody around." So Kurt Vonnegut certainly recognized Rita Wright's important role as a cultural conduit, as a gatekeeper of Western literature that was being translated in the Soviet Union, and also as a window to the West for Soviet people. So unfortunately, she was never allowed to come to the United States. The United States was not the problem. The problem was the Soviet Union and the Soviet Writers Union, which did not allow her to travel to the US. Excuse me, this is showing the prominent place that Vonnegut held for Rita Wright. You can see his photo here in the background of this photograph. And she said, "I think of him as if he were my own son. After all, I am the one giving him a second birth here in the Soviet Union." So Rita Wright certainly understood her important role as a cultural conduit, as a window to the West for Soviet readers. Back to Kurt Vonnegut's travels to the Soviet Union. He did travel to the Soviet Union 3 times. The first time was in 1967 with his friend Bernard O'Hare on their way to Dresden. If you've read Slaughterhouse-Five, you will remember that in the introductory portion, Vonnegut is talking about visiting with Bernard O'Hare and preparing for their trip to Dresden. And this was really the trip that finally solidified for Vonnegut what form Slaughterhouse-Five, the book, was going to take. He had been working on this book for 20 years. So on their way to Dresden, they stopped in Leningrad. Their purpose for stopping was to hopefully see the 50th anniversary celebrations of the Russian Revolution. And they were there for less than 24 hours because they were kicked out of the Hotel Astoria. There are sort of some apocryphal stories that go around about the reasons why, but the official reason was that their documents were not in order. So that was not a very long trip in 1967 to Leningrad. Finally, Vonnegut, after meeting Rita Wright in Paris, did make a quite short trip, a 5-day trip in October 1974, specifically to visit Rita Wright in Moscow. Again, he was accompanied by Jill Kremens. And the purpose of the visit really was to see Rita Wright. So Kurt Vonnegut tried to avoid official meetings. He, really wanted to spend quality time with Rita and her colleagues, and basically meet with the people that she wanted him to meet with. So here we see Kurt and Rita in front of the house of Tolstoy. And on the right here, we see them under a portrait of Vladimir Mayakovsky, who had been a very close colleague and friend of Rita in the 1920s when she first came to Moscow. Mayakovsky and his famous lover and creative in her own right, Lily Brick, had taken Rita Wright under their wing. So Kurt tried to avoid official meetings and such as much as possible. However, he did have a few official meetings, and he was gratified to meet some wonderful writers when he was in Moscow. This is a picture of Vonnegut with the famous writer Konstantin Simonov that I found in the archive in Moscow in Simonov's papers. Simonov was a really important figure in the Soviet literary scene. He was also a World War II veteran. He was the author of a series of books about the war. He was a war poet, and he was editor-in-chief of several of those important literary journals that I mentioned between 1946 and 1958. And then also between 1946 and 1979, Simonov was secretary of the Union of Writers of the USSR. So a really important figure. And Vonnegut expressed in some of his letters after that trip how gratified he was to meet Simonov. He also was able to meet with some young theater folk who were preparing to stage that theater adaptation of Slaughterhouse-Five. And so this is a picture of this theater collective with Vonnegut and Rita in her apartment. Actually, on the left is Mikhail Levitin, who was the director of the play, which was called The Wanderings of Billy Pilgrim. I'm not sure who the second person is, but the person right in the middle is the famous Yuli Kim, who was, again, a famous creative scenarist and did some, he was the librettist for this play. Vonnegut did not get to see the play in person. Unfortunately, it wasn't staged until the end of the next year. However, he did send a telegram that has become very famous, congratulating the whole team on the launch of the play. And you'll see in this telegram here, which he sent to Levitin, the director, he says, "The Soviet Army saved my life in 1945. Now they give me a theater. If I could enlist, I would. Much love to you, my brothers and sisters in the arts." Actually, Rita Wright had asked Kurt Vonnegut to send this telegram. The play had been stalled. She was afraid it wasn't going to happen. And the reason was that there had been some rumblings that Kurt Vonnegut was a pacifist. Kurt Vonnegut was a pacifist, and we can't stage a play based on a book by a pacifist. So Rita Wright went to all sorts of trouble to get over this barrier, including having Konstantin Simonov, again, who was head of the Writers Union, or secretary of the Writers Union, to also write a letter in support of the play. So it was eventually staged. And here is a picture of actually the original playbill. I'm very grateful to some of my colleagues in Moscow who were able to track this down and send it to me. I just received this about 2 weeks ago. So I was really excited to get this original playbill from 1975, 1976 from the staging of the play. I was also able to interview the director, Mikhail Levitin, shown here in his office, where he is the director of the Moscow Hermitage Theater. I interviewed him in 2019, and I wanted to show, again, what a prominent place portraits of both Rita Wright and Kurt Vonnegut play on his very shelves at the theater, just a symbol of how important both of these figures were in his life and career. The authorities took note of Vonnegut's visit to the Soviet Union in 1974, and this is a little scrap of a report from his supposed translator, who actually was someone who had been assigned to mind him during his visit. And so the translator had written a report to the Writers Union about Vonnegut and the things he did, the things he saw, the things he said. And I'm running short of time here, so I'm going to sort of go through a few things quite quickly. And I want to, okay, so we'll get to Vonnegut's second trip, or actually third trip. He stopped again this time in Leningrad to see Rita Wright and some of her colleagues, and also to sign a contract for the publication of the first collection of translations of his books that was coming out. The Soviet Union had recently, by 1977, signed on to the International Copyright Convention. And so before that, there had been no contracts, no real royalties to speak of or anything, but this time it was imperative that he come and sign a contract. I wanted to end by talking about why Vonnegut was so popular in the Soviet Union, what Soviet readers saw in him. To put it succinctly, they found many of the things in Vonnegut that readers all over the world found in him. His readers perceived a personal connection with him as an author. In the Soviet Union, reading Vonnegut was cool. You know, he had so many Vonnegut-isms and sort of a unique lexicon that people could latch onto and use in their daily life as a sign that they were progressive and sophisticated and that they knew Western literature like Vonnegut. Of course, we can't overlook the fact that Rita Wright's translations were just amazingly masterful. She was a wonderful, wonderful translator. And really rendered Vonnegut in Vonnegut's voice, and that was one of her goals when she translated any foreign author, was to find their voice and to connect with readers on that level. Vonnegut appealed to a swath of different readers, youth and university students, the technical intelligentsia, so-called. So these were people who were interested in science, but also interested in technology and the social sciences. He also appealed to science fiction fans. There was a huge fan base that read Vonnegut as a science fiction author and read him alongside really, prominent Soviet science fiction authors and other foreign Soviet fiction authors. Reading Vonnegut was also an escape for boredom, for the humdrum everyday life during the period of so-called stagnation in the Soviet Union. Key themes that resonated with Vonnegut, resonated with Soviet readers. Again, many of these are universal to Vonnegut lovers across the world. His humanity comes through in his books. He offered people moral codes about how to live a decent and moral life. And he helped people grapple with, existential and really important questions about science and technology and ethics. He was also, an American who was very critical of America, very critical of the flaws of capitalism and crass consumerism. And so, again, this is one way that he resonated with Soviet readers, but also one thing that made him acceptable for the Soviet authorities. Translations were censored, and there were basically two kinds of censorship that Rita Wright had to subject her translations to, and that her editors also subjected her work to: political censorship and moral censorship. So anything remotely critical of the Soviet Union had to be changed and softened, and anything remotely speaking about sex, sexuality, violence, obscenities, all of these things also had to be softened, edited out, changed. And I will say that Rita Wright was a master at rendering let's say, sexual themes in ways that could be acceptable for Soviet publications, leaving no doubt in the reader's mind what was being referenced, but doing so in a really remarkable and witty way. I want to end my talk by showing you some really precious artifacts that I found. Um, this is a series of drawings that I found in the Lilly Library here at Indiana University. Um, that represent the work of two young artists who were growing up in Kiev in Soviet Ukraine in the 1970s, Natalia and Alexander. And these were both, they were young, they were, in their early teens, and they were Vonnegut fans who clearly were amazing artists and very creative, and they decided to work together to illustrate Kurt Vonnegut's books. And so they came up with a series of just beautiful illustrations and sent them to Kurt Vonnegut. And that is how I found these wonderful drawings in the Lilly Library, and was able to track down Natalia. I was able to find her online, and we have become good friends. And it's just been a wonderful story. But I love thinking about the way that Soviet readers, particularly young people, became co-creators with Kurt Vonnegut. When they read him and were inspired by his ideas and the imagery in his books, and really undertook, these creative tasks as alongside Kurt Vonnegut. And I know he was very touched when he received these illustrations from Natalia, and they were eventually able to meet. She was in the United States for a time as a postdoc, and it's just a lovely story that I'm unfolding in the book that I'm working on. One last artifact that is another wonderful co-creation. A group of young people, college students in the 1970s in St. Petersburg, worked together on this samizdat, or self-published book of Bakunin, that they scoured all of Vonnegut's work for the sayings and the teachings of Bakunin, and compiled them into a book that they would then share around with their friends. So I am intrigued by these examples of co-production, and really would love to have as many as possible. So if there's anyone out there who knows of some examples of co-productions like this, or artifacts that show Kurt Vonnegut's popularity and how he traveled around in the Soviet Union in people's hearts and in their creative spirits, I would love to know about those. So thank you so much for your attention. This is another shout out to the Lilly Library at IU, which was just so wonderfully rich and accommodating for my research, as well as the other archival locations that I was able to access. My goals right now are to finish my book on Kurt Vonnegut in the Soviet Union, hopefully get that out there and tell this story to more people. As I mentioned, I'm really looking for these examples of co-creations, artifacts that I can share. I think it would be amazing to have an exhibition or something like that that would showcase these artifacts and the story, perhaps at the Vonnegut Museum in Indianapolis. And eventually I would love to write the biography of Rita Wright, the wonderful translator. Her biography has not been written, and she certainly also has an amazing story to tell. So apologies for going over time, and I'm really looking forward to your questions. And I will invite my dear colleague Tatiana Saburova to take us through the Q&A session. Thank you so much, Tatiana.
Thank you so much, Sarah. And that was a fascinating talk, and so many stories, not just the story of Kurt Vonnegut in the Soviet Union, but stories of the Cold War, stories of connections, disruptions, co-productions. And I think that's exactly what makes history of this time so exciting and so human when we just don't talk about the politics, right? But make this history through the people and through these connections and make this story really with a personal and really moving touch. And your discoveries, I think, are just fascinating and more to unfold and unpack in this story to make this time even more interesting and exciting. And I think you also kind of break these stereotypes and contribute to the breaking stereotypes about the Cold War at just time of the confrontation, because we can see a lot of connections and cultural diplomacy. That's a really important field to discover. I encourage our audience to submit questions. We have Q&A section, and I believe Sarah Phillips will be more than happy to answer them live in this Zoom session. And we have first questions. We have a question from James. Great talk. I would love for you to talk a bit more about why Soviet Russian readers might have appreciated Vonnegut in a science fiction frame. Was it because they saw his writing as a sort of dystopic and pointing out the flaws in their society and culture?
Thank you, James. That's a wonderful question. So I think you're right. Yes, the readers who were reading Vonnegut as a science fiction writer were really intrigued about, as you said, the dystopias, right, that come through in his writing, thinking about advancements in technology and science and how to harness the potential of those advancements in an ethical way, right? In a way that is not going to smother the earth in Ice Nine, shall we say, as happened in Cat's Cradle. So really thinking deeply about humans' relationship to science and technology, I think was important for people, and it was very timely, these discussions. On the other hand, I will say I heard several people, and actually Natalia, who I mentioned, said this to me very poignantly. She said, I came to Kurt Vonnegut for the social science, or I'm sorry, for the science fiction, but I stayed for the wisdom. I stayed for his, moral ideas about how to live, how to be a decent person in an indecent society was one way that she put it. So I think all of the above is true. I think, yes, people loved the sci-fi aspect of it, but it certainly wasn't a surface engagement, right? They really took these questions seriously about how to live a decent life, a moral life in modern conditions.
Yeah, and I think it resonated so well with the moral search of the Russian intelligentsia, the Russian intellectuals, especially in the 1970s, right? With this search for truth, authenticity, and these ideas that could be kind of, enlightening and in this life at this time. We have more questions coming, so I don't want to monopolize the field here. So we have a question for Barbara. What was the FBI take on Kurt Vonnegut's friendship with the Russians during the Cold War?
Yes, thank you, Barbara. I actually blew through that slide that showed the one FBI document actually that I've been able to find, a declassified FBI memorandum from March 1971 that mentioned Kurt Vonnegut. That's the only FBI document I've been able to find that mentions Vonnegut. Keep in mind, this is before he even met Rita Wright for the first time in Paris in 1972. And this FBI memorandum says that so-and-so mentioned that So, okay, so-and-so advised special agent so-and-so that so-and-so mentioned he had been to the New York Committee to Free Angela Davis, was writing an article on Angela Davis. So-and-so wished to know the telephone number or agent for Kurt Vonnegut, the writer and playwright. So my take on this document is that someone was visiting from the USSR, was kind of tattling on someone else who was in the USA, visiting from the USSR, and this person wanted to know Kurt Vonnegut's phone number. That's all the information I have. And so I was actually surprised that I didn't track down a more robust FBI file on Kurt Vonnegut. It might be that I'm not looking in the right places, but so far this 1971 memorandum is what I have been able to find.
Yeah, thank you, Sarah. We have more questions coming, and we have a question from Devin. Devin, what do you think? What aspects of God Bless You, Mr. Rosewater resonated with Vonnegut's Russian readers? It's hard kind of, to imagine and think in this mind, but maybe you have your assumption what could be the thing.
Yes, and that's an interesting question, Devin. Of Vonnegut's books that people mentioned as being, really key to their attachment with him, or, really life changers. To be honest, Rosewater never really came up. It didn't come up for the people that I was interviewing. I do have ideas, about what readers would have seen in Rosewater. Which is the story of a fabulously rich person, Elliot Rosewater, who basically gives everything away, does not care about his wealth, and is a friend of the outcast. So I think, in a way, all three of those things would have resonated with Soviet readers. Of course, Rosewater is a huge, critique of capitalism. It's a huge critique of the excesses of capitalism, and the gap between the very rich and the very poor. So that's probably not a very satisfying answer, but that's what I can come up with, kind of on the fly. But I do think it's important to recognize the fact that Rosewater was not a favorite of Soviet readers.
Okay, and kind of to continue this topic about how Kurt Vonnegut was perceived or seen in the Soviet Union, we have a question from Daphna. Thank you for a great talk. And Daphna is wondering if you know how Vonnegut was perceived by Soviet science fiction writers. Was he perceived as part of the genre or something different?
Daphna, I know who you are. And that's a wonderful question, and one that I honestly, I don't know the answer to. So I would welcome insights from anyone who's more familiar with Soviet science fiction. I actually have not seen this question addressed anywhere, and I do not know. I don't know if the Strugatsky brothers, for example, saw Kurt Vonnegut as a fellow traveler. If they read Vonnegut, I just don't know. It's a wonderful question, and one that I will definitely dig into. Thank you for it.
Okay, we have a question about your research, because you started with this research background, and we have a question from Eliza. Thank you so much for this incredible piece of history. I felt teleported to this precious correspondence and spirit. And Eliza is asking, how did you come to Vonnegut? What was the beginning of the story? And also, did you think of collecting Vonnegut species in private collections post-Soviet houses or whatever?
Okay.
Do you have your own collection?
Thank you, Eliza. Intriguing questions. So how did I come to Vonnegut? I was part of a project that was launched by the College Arts and Humanities Institute. And it was a project where faculty members at IU from different disciplines read 5 of Kurt Vonnegut's books and then did popular blog posts from the perspective of our disciplinary kind of perspective. And I have to be honest, I had never really read Vonnegut before I was invited to be part of this wonderful project, which was called Sala University. Of course, Sala being a main character in Sirens of Titan and a couple of other Vonnegut books. And it was in actually reading Mother Night. Mother Night was one of the books that we, were assigned as part of this project, and learning more about Vonnegut's thoughts on totalitarianism. He has a beautiful description of totalitarianism in that book. And just kind of following the breadcrumbs and learning about his popularity in the Soviet Union. And I became intrigued by the story. And there's a wonderful master's thesis that was written at the University of Texas by Yana Skorobogatov, a literary scholar, which was really helped set the foundation for some of my thinking. And then, of course, getting to know the story of Donald Feeney, I kind of got sucked into the story. So that's the origins. In terms of a collection, yes, I mean, I have tried to collect what I can. I do have my own copies of those Vonnegut collections, the 1978 collection, which people call the orange one, the 1981 collection, which people call the red one, which was the one that I showed on the opening slide. So yes, anything anyone has and wants to share with me, I would love to see it and think about how to archive it responsibly so that other people can see these materials.
Okay, and we have 2 questions from different people, but related to the Soviet literature and connecting Soviet literature with Kurt Vonnegut. So the first question is from Ani. Thank you, Professor Phillips, for sharing your wonderfully research project. I wonder if during your work you came across any mention of Vonnegut's reciprocated interest in Soviet literature. And another connection question from James, kind of a comment. The only book I can think of that Vonnegut might have related to in Soviet literature like that is We by Yevgeny Zamyatin. So can you comment on this connection between Vonnegut and Soviet literature?
Yes, absolutely. Thank you for this question. And actually, Brian, you answered Ani's question. Yes, Kurt Vonnegut was a fan of Zamyatin and the book We. He's even been quoted as saying that he shamelessly ripped it off for his own writing. And I don't know how to say this politely. I don't get the sense that Vonnegut read a lot of Soviet literature. I really don't. When he was asked, what Russian writers do you like, he would say Dostoevsky, he would say Gogol, and he would say Chekhov. And he didn't really talk much about contemporary writers in the Soviet Union. He became, I wouldn't say friends, but acquaintances with Dovlatov when Dovlatov moved to the United States. I believe Vonnegut also knew and read Voinovich. Of course, he had read Solzhenitsyn, and so he did talk about Solzhenitsyn's influence on his work and his thinking, but that was about it. He didn't spend a lot of time, at least talking about his own reading of Soviet literature.
Yeah, thank you, sir. We have a lot more questions came, but unfortunately, that's time to wrap up. And I will pass all these questions to Professor Phillips, and I do hope she will answer that, because we have about Kurt Vonnegut as socialist, or the nuclear war, danger and threat at this time, and translation questions as well. So I want to end with one last question here, and that's a question from Dalia. When should we expect the book?
Wonderful question. So I plan to have a draft ready by the end of the year, and I haven't yet pitched it to publishers, but I'm feeling I'm in a good place where that can happen. So gosh, I'd love to say that a year from now you might have the book in your hands. That's probably a little optimistic, but let's shoot for that. Let's shoot for a year down the road. Thank you so much.
And then we will have a book presentation, right?
Absolutely.
That's another reason to talk more about Kurt Vonnegut. Okay, thank you so much. Thank you for all these wonderful questions, really provocative and thoughtful. And thank you, Sarah Phillips, for this exciting and just fascinating talk. And I'm turning this conversation back to our wonderful host, Vanessa.
Great. Thank you again for joining us and participating in this evening's live stream. I would like to personally thank Professor Phillips and Dr. Saburova for their time and expertise. We are grateful to you all. I would like to also acknowledge the IU Alumni Association and its members for assisting with tonight's program. Finally, I should acknowledge that events like this would not be possible without the support of donors who understand the value of a liberal arts education. If you would like to support events like tonight's presentation or other opportunities that connect alumni and friends with the College of Arts and Sciences, please consider making a contribution to the IU Bloomington College Alumni Engagement Fund at the Indiana University Foundation. Until next time, please take care.